Hello and welcome to another episode of Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we're going to look at free agency because right now, the two biggest, most famous, most popular free agents in the entire sport just left the UFC within the last 6 months. Now, we have talked about UFC contracts in an episode or two back, and we noted a lot of things about Francis Ngannou and Nate Diaz, and we got a lot of stuff right. John, how the hell are you? And talk to me a little bit here. Give me your overall, just your knee-jerk reaction right now to Francis Ngannou exiting the UFC.
Well, first of all, I'm doing good. Thank you for asking.
Yes,
It's a very eventful last few weeks in MMA. Very twists and turns. We were not planning on this, but now it's official that Ngannou is a free agent, and there's been so much news about him being out there that made this the subject for the week. I should note, though, it's actually not in the last 6 months. Diaz only officially became a free agent, I believe, in November.
Oh, wow.
Remember,
Okay.
because he had the exclusive negotiating period,
Yeah,
and they
right.
only waived that, I believe, because they probably talks broke down in November. So that was it's really recent that this happened. But yeah, we can take a victory lap. I mean, not often. I often get stuff wrong, but we'll ignore the stuff I get wrong. But on these, I was remarkably accurate, I think, about a lot of stuff. I wrote an article about Ngannou's contract. I wrote what the offers might be out there for him, what the UFC could offer. We talked about the contracts. And a lot of people seem to be in denial that he could be a free agent with the sunset clause for a while. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That ended up being true. And then I said he was probably a free agent early December. And, a lot of people, I got some pushback on that. And then it ends up Ngannou saying he was a free agent in December. And it's not like I'm Nostradamus here or anything, or I'm not making wonder predictions. I just read the document again and again. I should note we're skipping over the fact that I was wrong the first time I said it. I had to correct myself later. So we're going to ignore that part. But eventually I was right. And that's the important thing. Eventually I was 100% right.
And you were 100% right before the news actually broke.
Yes, well, I'm gonna run with it. I'm 100% right. So occasionally I get things right.
So you are Nostradamus.
Nostradamus. Yes, I agree. I like that. I like that take.
Nostradamus. Okay. Let's go over how we got here because they both became free agents in different ways because of their very different contracts. Now, you mentioned the sunset clause, and you also mentioned an exclusive negotiating period. Did they both have those?
No, Ngannou, because he had the new contracts that showed up in around 2017, his contract did not have an exclusive negotiating period. Nate Diaz, on the other hand, had an exclusive negotiating period, but what he did not have that sunset provision that Ngannou took advantage of. And so they're two very different contracts, but they both managed to exit the UFC in almost the same time. So that's a remarkable thing. And I guess we should go over it a little bit for those. We talked about this a lot on our first episode that we ever did on the Hey Not the Face podcast about their contracts. But really briefly, Nate Diaz's contract, he signed the older pre-2017 contract. The reason those contracts were changed in 2017 is because of the antitrust lawsuit. The UFC was trying to mitigate any potential damages going forward, and that was the end of the first class period, the start of the second. So they introduced changes in the contract. So we have basically two different classes for that lawsuit. So Nate Diaz, his contract had endless extensions. It could last in perpetuity. He signed a 5-fight deal back in 2016 before the second Conor McGregor fight. 6 years later, he was still under contract. And the only reason he finally got out of that contract is he demanded a fight. They booked him with Chimaev, the guy that they refused apparently to book him against anybody else. He asked for a bunch of other fighters. They wouldn't give it to him. They wanted him to fight Chimaev. And fortunately for, I guess the gods are smiling on Nate Diaz because right before the fight, he grossly missed weight, and he got a new opponent and ended up leaving the UFC on a victory when obviously the plan was to leave him looking terrible with a beatdown. So that's Nate Diaz. Ngannou, on the other hand, won the title, a championship, finished his last fight of his contract, but he has a championship clause and a new contract that has a sunset provision that ended on, I guess, December 9th, he said, last year. And the only reason that contract, even though the championship clause has 3 fights or a year, whatever sooner, it's basically additional 3 fights. So if you turn down fights in the past, they could have extended that contract 6 more months every time you turned down a fight. With this new contract, he didn't have to fight anyone. He could sit out on injury. And at the 5-year mark, he was a free agent. So that's how we got here. That both these guys, the number 1 heavyweight in the world, the UFC champion at the time, no longer now stripped, and one of their biggest draws have both entered the market.
I need you to clear something up for me because I see reports that say that Ngannou was released. Can you clear up if he was released or did he just leave after his contract expired?
Well, the UFC and Dana White that's the purpose of Dana White is to be out there and pivot everything and polish everything in a way that makes the UFC look good. And so for the UFC, for their PR, it looks good to say we released him. Like basically we didn't want him anymore. We couldn't work with this guy. But the truth is, and Ngannou confirmed it in our Hawani interview and other sources, his contract was up December 9th. He was free from the UFC to talk to other promotions. The only reason he didn't is he was negotiating with the UFC and he thought it'd be a nice gesture to talk just to them, to not make a big deal about it so they can get a deal done. But truth is, his contract was ended. It was done, and there was no exclusive negotiating period. He was free to go anywhere else. And the reason the UFC released him, I guess, to not only look good, but they say we waived also their matching rights. Well, is that big a move considering we're all pretty sure they can't match whatever he gets because whatever he gets is going to ask for a much less restrictive contract. He's going to demand a much less restrictive contract, and that's something the UFC that's the reason they couldn't get a contract in the first place. So them waiving the right to match doesn't really mean anything because we know that they're not going to be able to match whatever offer he gets because it's going to be an offer that's unacceptable to the UFC.
What do you think that the UFC really offered to him?
Well, he talked a bit about in the Hawani interview. He mentioned that he wanted a 3-fight deal and no extensions, and people I think latched on to his comments about I wanted insurance for all the fighters. I wanted an advocate, which is a co-determination. Is in Germany they have that, but co-determination where a fighter advocate sits on the board, and he wanted also sponsors. And people made a big deal about that. But if you listen to the interview, it's pretty clear he made those requests, but then he threw them out when they were shot down. He just wanted to get them on the table. So I don't think those were the stumbling blocks. He had asked for a 3-fight deal, apparently the UFC accepted, but what they wouldn't accept is not the other provisions in the contract that restricted him. I'm guessing like the tolling provisions for injuries, the championship clause, all the things that could add fights or duration if he turns down fights or if he's the champion, because that's what locks him in. And his whole thing was, I want to get my 3 fights all the way in a year, 15 months, and then move on to boxing at that point. And that was the draw. Now, money-wise, they talked about him offering him more than anyone since Brock, even the highest paid heavyweight, more than Brock Lesnar. And people latched on the $8 million amount that Brock Lesnar made at UFC 200, which, of course, again, we're the ones that brought that up, pointed that out, because no one else is digging through the lawsuit like we are. They enter the documents. So the $8 million figure, I think that's plausible, but in the interview, he talked about, I could have made $8 million. I was offered $8 million against Jones. I think it's based on the UFC, the way they operate. My guess is, and I got a strong feeling about this because we've been pretty close to right on a lot of these offers to fighters, is that the amount they're offering them was probably about $4 to $5 million a fight, plus an upside on pay-per-view and across a certain point. So the Ngannou fight versus Jones, because it's a big fight, that's where he might have passed 8 or even 10 million, but only for a fight of that size. I very much doubt, and I'll try to confirm this week, I very much doubt he was getting 8 million guaranteed per fight. In fact, I'm almost sure he was not getting 8 million guaranteed per fight.
Okay, talk to me a little bit about Jon Jones's deal here, because he just signed an 8-fight deal, which to me seems just crazy, because wouldn't his contract have been up next year?
I mean, that's the thought. He supposedly had signed that contract in 2019, so next year it would be up. And so, you listen to Schaefer, his new agent, manager, advisor, whatever, and they're talking on Hawani, and they weren't clear. He said it didn't really matter because he already had 8 fights still remaining on his deal. And so really this is just a modification. So is it a new contract or just an addendum and the old contract's still in place and he'll be a free agent next year? I got a feeling it's a new contract because that's how the UFC usually operates. So he's a new contract, right? Which means now it no longer has that Ngannou potentially a free agent next year. He can't negotiate and claim, hold that above the UFC to negotiate more. He couldn't leave the UFC and fight Ngannou in a major fight somewhere else. So, in fact, I think there's a good chance that the timing was because of that. Because Jones signed this new deal with the UFC, they could now release, I put that in air quotations, release Ngannou and book the Gane fight. Because no longer were they terrified that Ngannou's leaving. Our big fear now is that Jones might leave in a year, and this big fight's going to happen outside the UFC. We don't want these big fights that can generate huge amounts of revenue and pay the fighters a lot to happen outside the UFC. So we have Jones locked up. We have one of the two people locked up. Now we're free to no longer negotiate with Ngannou. So I think that's what happened. Regarding Jones, like purse, it's interesting too, is they claim Jones is the highest paid heavyweight ever. So is he higher paid than Ngannou would have got? If Ngannou signed, would Jones still be the highest paid heavyweight? That, to me, that's kind of fascinating. And my only, Jones already was making, around $5 million a fight before, but he was asking, remember, to fight Ngannou, the talk was he wanted Deontay Wilder money. And it doesn't sound like he's getting anywhere close to Deontay Wilder money. He's getting good money. He might make, if it sells well as a pay-per-view, 8 figures with the UFC, which is tremendous for the UFC. It's basically only Khabib, who's behind only, Conor McGregor. You're in that class of payout. But it's still a small amount compared to what a big fight in boxing would make, what Deontay Wilder made against Fury, which is what Jones was apparently basing on before. So it doesn't look like he got anything close to that.
What are their options? Because you've got these two guys, Nate Diaz and Francis Ngannou. They're in 2 different weight classes. Nate Diaz has the Jake Paul option, because Jake Paul is over at PFL. I've seen people suggest that Francis Ngannou and Jake Paul do things, but I don't ever really see that happening. I do feel that Jake Paul is smart enough to not do that.
That'd be murder. I mean, there's weight classes for a reason. Exactly. And even if Jake Paul's, let's say, a better skilled boxer at this point, because he's been working on it, what the size difference, the force that's generated a guy in Ngannou's side, and the amount of punishment he can take because he's so much bigger, that fight would not last. That would be, oh my God. I mean, I'd pay to see it though. I recommend they do it. I recommend they do it.
But anyways, does it feel like Nate has more immediate options that could pay out tremendously because Jake Paul is right there and has been calling for this, and there's the rumored war chest of somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million that the PFL has. Do they throw all of that money or most of that money at Nate Diaz and Jake Paul, or do they throw the majority of it at a Francis Ngannou and try and get another heavyweight in there? Tell me the options of these guys because they seem endless.
Well, let's go. Since you brought up Nate Diaz, let's do Nate Diaz first, right? Okay. So Nate Diaz's options are, he actually has a lot of, I think in some ways Ngannou has more options, even though Diaz is the more immediate pay-per-view attraction, right? For Nate Diaz, the big obvious one is already on the table is Jake Paul's called him out. Now, what I find kind of interesting about that is someone told me that Nate Diaz never lies. To go back to listen carefully what he says, right? And that's, he is sticking to his guns, and you go back and you listen to, he says out, about Chimaev, and people will call him a ducker, but you go back and listen to some of his comments. You're right. He kind of holds he won't turn down anybody, but at the same time, he has a sense of his own honor and value. And I'm listening to some of his old comments about Jake Paul, and he is not, if you listen to him, I don't think Diaz is like immediately wants to jump into that fight because I don't think he respects Jake Paul. And it doesn't in Diaz universe, there's a lack of respect. Also, it's like I'm making Jake Paul. I'm the guy who has legitimate MMA, combat sports cred, and you're trying to make your bones against me. I got to be compensated because I'm bringing that to the table. I'm putting that at risk against you. You're an influencer. You can go off and do your YouTube videos afterwards. This is what I do. This is my life. So PFL desperately needs pay-per-view attractions. They built this pay-per-view branch of the PFL because the PFL's, MMA doesn't do much besides the big stars. They kind of followed one and did a lot of like smoke and whistles, smoke and mirrors about, all the like the smart cage and the brand and all that stuff. But truthfully, is the big fights, big fighters are needed to make it. And which is smart as they realize that they made this pay-per-view division. But now they need pay-per-view attractions to fill the division. And there's really only two major guys out there right now, Ngannou and Nate Diaz. The problem with PFL and Ngannou is they really don't have an opponent for Ngannou. I'm sure they'll pay him, and we'll get to Ngannou in a little bit. I'm sure they'll pay him because they want the brand identity with, having the best heavyweight. But for Diaz, they have an immediate, potentially big money-making fight with Jake Paul. But Diaz knows that. He knows this is a money-making fight. He also knows it's a lot of it's built on him. So I do think it's very possible he ends up going there. But I think people are going to be shocked at the offer that's going to take. I got a feeling it's going to take like a large, like a $10 million guarantee for Nate Diaz to go in there, and maybe even more guarantee on the side that they're going to eventually fight MMA. So he's not left. If he loses in boxing, he never gets a chance to get it back. So maybe they'll have to put in escrow another $5 million to guarantee the MMA fight. But let's say $10 million guarantee. And then they're going to have to give a split to the boxers, but it won't be 50%. Nate Diaz, I'm pretty strong. I'm pretty sure will not accept like he gets a cut of the 50% of the pay-per-view revenue like they're offering. He's going to be looking at a boxing split, and he's going to want probably even a larger split than Jake Paul, because if you listen to his comments, he views himself as kind of the A side, as the guy that's putting up more risk to fight Jake Paul. So PFL is not only going to have to offer him, let's say, a guarantee of $10 million, but if it crosses a certain point, they're probably have to give up 70% of the pay-per-view revenue to the two guys in the ring, Jake Paul and Diaz, and they'll probably have to, and Jake Paul will probably have to give up the majority of it, maybe not a large majority, but let's say 55, 45, I don't know what the split will be, to Nate Diaz. And he has a lot of leverage there because PFL needs this fight. They need these fights where Nate Diaz actually has other fights available on the table. Rizin, remember he posted that photo of Rizin?
Mm-hmm.
Nate Diaz, Manny Pacquiao fight is very plausible in Rizin over the summer. Manny Pacquiao is going to fight in Rizin. Nate Diaz is an opponent they can bring in. I don't think the problem for Nate Diaz in that is it's going to be a Japanese-based fight. So it's going to be hard. The marketing and stuff in America is going to be hard. So it might not sell a lot of pay-per-views in the US. So he might not be able to demand, mega amounts of money there, but it gives him an option. Like if you PFL aren't willing to deal with me, I can go to Rizin and get a sizable amount of money to fight Manny Pacquiao in boxing. The other big option, there's one other big option for Nate Diaz. Well, I should say there's several small options. He can do promotional work with bare knuckle. I don't think he's going to do bare knuckle boxing, but he can use his name value to get money from these other promoters by showing up and attaching himself to them, kind of like Jake Paul did with saying, I'm the, I'm representing the PFL, super fight pay-per-view wing, right? Mm-hmm. Diaz can do the same. You can even demand that from PFL, that they have to pay him just to even be attached his name to the promotion. But he can go, market himself to bare knuckle boxing, never box in the ring, but show up and add his name to it. He can also, he has there's some photos of him in pro wrestling. I could see that's not going to pay a lot, but I could see him doing some pro wrestling stuff, even though he is not the guy that looks anything like a pro wrestler. But the big one, I think, is his biggest piece of leverage is I very much think the UFC is going to come back to him with an offer to come back to the UFC, specifically to fight Conor McGregor. And there's a ton of leverage with him fighting Conor McGregor there, because Nate Diaz is not under contract. Conor McGregor's contract should be up at the end of this year based on the sunset clause. On top of that, the UFC's got 2 years left in their ESPN deal going forward, right? Mm-hmm. After this year, there'll be 2 more years. They've got to convince ESPN that the pay-per-views still sell and make money. Last year, they didn't sell many. They have to spike up those pay-per-view sales to get a better deal from ESPN or anybody else to convince them to unload a ton of money on the pay-per-views. So they need a big hit, right? Mm-hmm. What's the one guaranteed hit they have? Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz.
Yeah.
And so that we need that big hit pay-per-view to show that we can still generate pay-per-view sales. So ESPN's happy. We also know if we don't get these two guys, they can just wait a little while and do it themselves. So we have to offer them basically more than we probably ever offered a fighter in the UFC to do this fight. I got a feeling that's what's going to happen. They're going to come back and eventually going to offer both those more than they've offered any fighters in the UFC to have that event in the UFC. But he can use that because before that happens, he can tell PFL, you've got to give me a pretty good offer because there's always this in the wings. There's always Rizin in the wings. And so Nate Diaz is a pretty good position.
I think, well, I have to hear because we're going to discuss Francis Ngannou in a moment. But based on what you're telling me, it seems like Nate is in the better position right now.
Well, I think Nate has the more clear-cut, solid, I guess, pot of gold down the rainbow.
And his is already built right now.
Exactly. The one drawback is I think Ngannou has more options in the fact that there's more uses for him for promoters. But yes, the person that has the two biggest fights readily available to him is Nate Diaz. There's two, and what's good for him, they're not both in one promoter, so he can play them against each other.
Yeah, and they're going to pay immediate big money.
Yeah, the one problem is he's got to get, he has this leverage, but this is MMA. They don't want to pay that much. And so will they but he has options. I think eventually he will get a very sizable deal from someone out of this.
Would the UFC allow Nate to do a smaller contract, 2 or 3 fights? Conversely, would PFL allow him to do 1 fight? Just curious.
I think because it's the big payout, because there's a built-in audience, because we're sure that those fights will probably sell, I think both promotions, both the UFC and PFL would be willing to do 1-fight deals.
Really?
I think in many ways, though, for PFL, it might be in Nate's interest to make sure it's a 2-fight deal, because if I box him and then there's another big fight in MMA, and if I lose, I get that, maybe even have the option. It's up to me if I want to have that MMA fight. Then I can get it back on an MMA fight.
Okay. All right. But you think the UFC would really only give him a 1-fight deal? You think they would actually do that?
Well, it really depends on what's going on with McGregor. If McGregor doesn't sign his contract and they're terrified that McGregor is going to be a free agent too, and they don't want that, terrified is a strong word, but the idea that those two, that's a fight that those two could leave the UFC and probably hold a boxing match between the two of them somewhere else and sell a lot, right? Mm. And so they know that. They know that there's a chance that fight could happen outside the UFC and make money. And so the UFC's at that point, they have to ask themselves, do we want to let this really big fight leave the UFC, right? Exit the UFC and not hold it here and not get the benefits with our cable provider, ESPN, that we're the one that provided them this massive blockbuster pay-per-view event. And so I think that's why. I think at that point, but again, the question I haven't got with Conor, we don't know. His contract should be up, but there is a separate. Remember, we talked about when you retire, there's a separate track. That's a 5-year. There's a 5-year sunset provision on the retirement as well, which is separate from the termination when you're when you're active, I guess, or when you're just refusing fights. Did McGregor retire at some point officially with them so that he could get on some sort of supplements to recover from his injury? If that's the case, then it might throw a wrinkle into it because he might not be up at the end of this year. His contract might not be terminated. The sunset provision might not kick up in November at the end of this year. It might be later than that.
Let's say Conor's contract is up next year. And let's say he waits and Nate waits and they're both free agents. Would it be a boxing match though? Or would it be bigger for them to go to a Bellator or to let all of the promotions fight over them for the biggest contract? To me, it seems like that would be the ideal route. Would they really be able to generate a bunch of interest in a boxing match between them? I feel like it would be MMA, but you're the expert here. So
to me right now, because the interest in kind of this YouTube boxing, and then you're not worrying about the UFC brand if you go into boxing. I thought it might be boxing because it'd throw a curve in the whole feud, but it might be MMA too. They might do an MMA event. They might sign with another promoter and make them put up, one of these promoters that are sitting on a war chest they got from investors, just, to put up a ton of money to guarantee it, or they might hold it themselves. Conor McGregor, both of them have their own promotions now, right?
Right.
Maybe it's their, it's kind of like, it's Mayweather Promotions, the money team. They're going to do it themselves. They're going to do what Klitschko did. It's going to be promoted by themselves and they'll keep the money. But I do think, obviously they're such big stars, there's interest that you would find a major partner, broadcast partner that would work with them. A DAZN would work with them. A Showtime would work with them. Someone would work with them that it would make it much more likely to be a success. And maybe it doesn't sell as well outside the UFC. Maybe it does half the numbers it does. But again, if it sells 1.5 million in the UFC, and let's say it sells 800,000 outside the UFC, you're still talking, you've got to guarantee those guys probably 25, 30 million because they know that's what they could make outside the UFC.
Wow. And that's for a boxing match?
Well, boxing, MMA, whatever,
Okay.
I'm sure you can hire people to do the investigate what's going to be more fan interest, to do surveys, polls, find the fans, say what's going to generate more interest, and then go that route. Showtime has those people. Other people have used them, to find that. That's some weird way why McGregor, Mayweather happened in the first place. Someone looked into it and figured out that there was such an interest that this would be a massive. They didn't take a guess. They conducted the research and figured out this is going to be a massive hit. There's interest for this, that people would buy it.
Wow. Let's talk about Francis Ngannou now. Focus on him. Give me his options because you say he might actually have more options. Tell me why you say that.
Well, his options aren't as clear cut like the Jake Paul and McGregor that there's this obvious big money fights there for him. But there's obviously a lot of options because people have already expressed a lot of interest in him. He can go to MMA, he can go to boxing. Well, let's start with the MMA first. As a promoter, MMA promoters, there's really two big, I think, options from an MMA. I think two serious suitors, and that's PFL and Bellator. Both of them, there's something to be said about signing Ngannou just for the brand awareness, to say, I have the number one heavyweight in the world. And that's worth a lot of money. Like we just talked about earlier, my assumption is the UFC was offering him like a $5 million guarantee to fight. That's not outside the realms of, people say, oh, these other promoters can't afford that. Even if they can't hold on events that generate that kind of money, they're probably willing to pay Ngannou like 5 million, maybe 6 million a fight just to say we have the number one heavyweight, right? Just to say that this guy is attached to our brand because it elevates the brand and brings awareness. It's a loss leader for them. So there's that option. With PFL, the problem with PFL is they don't have really any fighters to put against him. So they would be paying him solely on the idea that he's going to bring awareness to the brand. Maybe they make an announcement and say he's going to fight the winner of our heavyweight tournament at the end. That's the big thing you win. Doesn't sound like much of a trophy winning their title, their tournament. If that's what you win, a chance to fight Ngannou, because you're going to get probably murdered. But still, that's what they can offer, something like that. Or they can hope, we've talked about before, we can hope that another UFC fighter follows after him, like a Stipe Miocic or someone else, sees that there's a way out of the UFC and they're close to the end of their contract, maybe their sunset provision, and they fall after them, they can put that on pay-per-view. But that's because PFL needs stars, because they need pay-per-view attractions. Even if they only break even or lose money on those pay-per-view attractions, they're going to have to sign them. So, and Ngannou is one of the few people out there, so they're going to have to go after him. They're also going to probably have to give him all the stuff he wanted that the UFC didn't, namely rights to his own sponsors, maybe the right to go box. It's probably going to be an open contract that he can, and like the UFC where they said you have to be exclusive to us and then you can box afterwards, they're probably going to have to give him the right to go box. They've already said they're willing to do that. The other thing is, unlike the UFC that wouldn't give up those extensions, they're probably going to have to make a contract that's much more in his favor, where it's like, I fight a number of fights over this period of time and then I'm done. There's no extensions. They'll probably have to agree to that. The thing is, PFL, neither PFL or Bellator or any MMA promotion, I don't see them ever doing like the one-off, because there's no big event right now you can hold with them that's worth just having a one-off. The value of Francis in MMA for these promoters right now is you have the number one fighter in the world heavyweight attached to your promotion. And so you're going to want more than a one-fight deal. You're probably going to want a multi-fight, like let's say 3-fight deal minimum, to get the value out of that, or that he has to promote your brand for 2 years or something. It can't be just a one shot with him. And that's unfortunate because, with Nate Diaz, he could do the one shot fight, but in MMA, Ngannou can't. The other thing, Ngannou, I guess with Bellator, the other option is Bellator can offer him they can offer him a little prestige, because Ryan Bader is not like a serious challenge, but at least he's in the top 10, right? To say like, listen, okay, at least I'm fighting someone that's in the ranking somewhere. So that's a positive for him. On top of that, Bellator has strong connections to boxing, and they've already made it clear we're going to offer him something he can do both. Again, Bellator, though, is going to want to wait and see hope that if they sign Ngannou, maybe they have him fight Ryan Bader and then wait and see if other UFC fighters show up, or they can start offering him boxing fights. But the other thing Bellator is going for him is they have connections to Rizin. And so I could see, and I've talked to people, an Ngannou Overeem fight in Japan could probably do pretty good business. We talked about before that Rizin does much more business than I think people in America are aware of. And so it's plausible that an offer that's in the ballpark of what he would get from Bellator, we're talking $5 million, $6 million a fight right now, what those promotions offer minimum, he could get that in Rizin too. So that could be enticing for him, that we also have this, if we can't get a fight in Bellator, we can get you over to Rizin and cover that nut. The other option, of course, is boxing for him. And, they've talked about it already that they want to, if they sign him in Ngannou to Showtime Bellator, they want to get him against Deontay Wilder. They think that's a money fight. We've heard Dillian White challenge him. We heard Misfits Boxing in England say we want to put him against Derek Chisora. And then finally we saw the big guy, Tyson Fury, just issued a new challenge against him. So there's interest in him in boxing. I think some people have a fantasy that he's just going to fight Fury and make, 100 million, 30, 50 million, some ridiculous amount. I'm not 100% sold on Tyson Fury's offer yet, but I do think Fury's kind of like maybe, feeling the winds, testing the water to see how much interest is there. But there is interest in fighting Ngannou because the promoters know that he's a name. We can generate money. We can have a big fight, and our stars probably view it as an easy fight because he's not been a professional boxer. Mm-hmm. And so there is that chance that I do think there is a chance that he fights Fury. There is a chance. I mean, he was in Saudi Arabia. Why is he in Saudi Arabia? I don't know. But Saudi Arabia, as we know, has made it no secret that they're interested in putting on big boxing matches and combat sports as part of their sports washing. It's very possible they're putting together a package for Ngannou versus a boxing, one of the top boxers, right? And one of these mixed events they want to talk about. So he has that option. I don't know if it's going to be a mixed event or it's going to be, a normal boxing match. But odds are, if I prefer, he probably does the mixed event match first because he might be able to hold his own, and then he can get a boxing match after that, so he can get 2 cash outs in boxing. Because I got a feeling if he fights a Wilder or Joshua or a Fury, he's going to lose, and that might be the end of the show. But who knows? Maybe he lucks out and they carry him and make him look good, and then he gets a second one. But in any case, if he gets one of those big fights, he'll make the 8 figures probably there. He'll get his 8-figure bout. I don't know what the upside is. It's the potential for Francis. One of the reasons he probably left the UFC, is there's no guarantee he will make more outside the UFC than he made in it. But the option to make a lot more is now available to him. Mm-hmm. In the UFC, it was denied. So he's not going to, if he signs with Bellator or PFL, he's not going to make really less than he made in the UFC. They're going to pay him pretty close to what the UFC was paying him because they have to. And even if they lose money on the deal, they'll do it. But now the possibility of one of these mega fights, be it him fighting, in boxing and making a lot of money, or potentially maybe luck out and one of the UFC fighters exit the UFC and they get some big fight outside the UFC and they get to keep all the money. The option's now there. It's no longer denied to him. And that's the benefit to him. So I don't want to say his options, like he's guaranteed to make a lot more outside the UFC, but he's not going to lose much. If the worst case scenario, he's not going to lose much what he would have gotten in the UFC. And best case scenario, that one of these fights will materialize and he'll make a lot more than he ever would have in the UFC.
Just to clarify, when you say that the Bellator could pay him close to what the UFC was, you mean what the UFC would have paid, like this supposed legendary $8 million deal, not what he was making currently, like when he left.
Yeah. Not the 600,000. One thing about MMA fans, you notice, is they either grossly exaggerate what fighters are making or grossly underestimate.
Right.
They're really off on the numbers. I mean, some fans are not. Those that listen to us are very knowledgeable. You guys are great, but the rest of the fans are clueless. And the fact that they view like 600,000 or $1 million, he's going to get $1 million, which is that's not a lot of money in combat sports for a guy of his caliber. No. I'm assuming that they offered him the $8 billion was for the Jones fight, but I'm assuming, based on what I know about UFC contracts, how they pay, that they were offering him about $4 to $5 million a fight, plus an upside on pay-per-view. That's what I'm assuming the UFC offered Ngannou, and then big fights like Jones would have made like $8 to $10 million. I am fairly certain that PFL and Bellator could offer him easily that amount. Maybe even more. Not that it'd be easy for them. It would strain their war chests, but they desperately need fighters like him. And for PFL, they desperately need him because they need stars to kick off this pay-per-view. For Bellator, Bellator, people might not be aware, but a lot of Bellator fighters at the top of Bellator make more than the comparable fighter in the UFC. That their top lightweight, number 5 in the world or whatever, or number 10 is making more than the similar position guy in the UFC. They're not making as much as the champs in the UFC, but they're paying them better than the guys, the next tier down challengers, basically the non-pay-per-view attractions in the UFC. Bellator paying $5 to $6 million just to have Ngannou be for a multi-fight deal. So $5 or $6 million a fight for multi-fights to say he is the face of Bellator. We have the number 1 heavyweight is probably worth it. Yeah. Because it elevates the brand. And, with Showtime and stuff, they can probably work out deals where the burden of that's not, all the money's not just coming out of like Bellator's budget that they, that they're going to give up, like rights to sponsorship sections of the cage, or we have access, you can have the rights to certain media distribution for certain areas if you think you can make more there. They're much more, because they have a boxing experience too, they're probably much more pliable in negotiations.
Going back to Francis Ngannou and boxing, you mentioned Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, but there's some other names out there, and you mentioned one, Dillian Whyte. Let me ask you about 2 others. One, very, very famous, in Usyk. Is there any opportunity for Francis to fight, say, an Alexander Usyk? And conversely, what kind of money could he make fighting, say, a Dillian Whyte or even an Andy Ruiz?
Well, with Usyk, I think there's no option right now because the interest is the 2 giants, Fury versus Ngannou. People, there's a reason why Joshua, Fury, and Wilder keep coming up because it's just comic book. Steven Espinoza of Showtime Boxing, head of Showtime Sports there, he kind of said it. It's like Superman versus Batman. It's a Marvel comic thing, which would be Hulk versus Thing. It just looks right to see these monsters fight each other. But if Usyk beats Fury, I do think there's a chance. Let's say Usyk beats Fury, and let's say Saudi Arabia is interested in putting on this freak show fight. Well, then I think there is a chance that maybe Usyk enters the picture. Wow. The heavyweight, the undisputed, and in boxing there really is an undisputed.
Right.
He'd be the undisputed boxing champion versus the number 1 heavyweight in MMA. That, maybe they dish out some money for that, but I don't think right now. I don't think outside of that happening, I don't think there's much interest because Usyk doesn't check off the list of things that make it such an exciting, interesting fight to fans to watch. Dillian Whyte is another option, and if I'm Ngannou, the first thing I'm doing is I'm making my own belt.
Okay.
I'm going out and I'm doing you remember the Terminator trailers for Terminator 2?
Mm-hmm.
And they showed the machines working and then the Terminator rose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing that with a belt, and it's my belt. It says number 1 heavyweight in the world because you want to remind people you're the number 1 heavyweight because the UFC is going to do everything they can to make people forget that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I do is if I'm doing a boxing fight, I probably look at the big names and try to get the biggest fights possible because there's no guarantee there's going to be a second fight if something happens. Now, if you can't get Wilder, because of whatever reason, if you can't get Fury or Joshua, then maybe I'm looking to Dillian Whyte because Whyte has a history. He has some sort of fan base in UK. I think it's gone down a bit since he lost to Fury, but it's still, there might be some interest there. But I'm probably not boxing him straight up because if you box him straight up and you lose, you've killed your other big fights. Maybe I do a kickboxing match because Dillian Whyte used to kickbox. Dillian Whyte maybe I try to push out some money and get Dillian Whyte into an MMA fight because Dillian Whyte has some MMA experience.
Mm.
So Andy Ruiz, kind of the same. I don't think it'd be there's just not the 2 titans going at it formula. Right. So you want to stick to the big guys first, at first, but after a while, if you can't get those fights made, that's the one hurdle I think is going to happen for both Diaz and Ngannou is in MMA, there's very little negotiation in the sense we have a fighter under contract. We want to sign you under contract. Let's make the fight. In boxing, there's a lot more moving parts. And so negotiations can be a lot harder. Mm-hmm. And so fights that make sense can make a lot of money. In fact, Top Rank, one of the Top Rank officials made a great comment. When there's a lot of money to make in a fight, the negotiations are fairly easy. When people think there's a lot of money in the fight, but there's not as much as they think, then it gets really difficult. Yeah. And so that's probably where we might get into some trouble. But if everybody, apparently a lot of people in boxing, even Al Heyman included, and Al Heyman thinks that it's probably true, think there's money to make in a Ngannou fight.
You say that a return to the UFC is not unlikely for Nate. Could we ever see, Francis Ngannou return, or is that scorched earth? Because you know how the UFC kind of operates when situations like this happen. However, we have seen guys take off, join other promotions, acrimonious split from the UFC. I'm thinking of our Andrei Arlovsky taking off to go to Affliction. They were not happy with that, but he got to come back. We've seen that, for a long time, we didn't get to see Vitor Belfort come back because there was some falling out or whatever. And then, Vitor's back, etc. So do we ever have an option to maybe see Ngannou come back to the UFC, or is that just a done deal, you think?
No, I think it's possible he comes back. He said it himself. I mean, Tito Ortiz is the most famous example where,
yes, there you go.
Dana White despised the man, and Tito Ortiz despised Dana White, and yet they kept coming back. They'd work together. Tito would leave, he'd come back. They worked together. Tito would leave. Tito tried to come back again. So they'd work together even after the scorched earth they had. Ngannou is nowhere near as bad. If Ngannou leaves, just starches some heavyweights outside the UFC. Maybe one fighter from the UFC leaves and fights him. He starches that guy, so he retains his position at the top of the heavyweight division and goes and boxes and doesn't get absolutely embarrassed. Well, his name value is only going to get bigger, right?
Right.
His Q rating is going to increase. At that point, the UFC might say, we would love to have you back. And maybe Ngannou says, hey, can we have these new contract terms? Maybe by that point, the UFC is like, yes, we're willing to now work differently. Or maybe the UFC says, we want to sign you at the end of your career. Here's a really big deal, but we want to lock you in now. And Ngannou's like, well, I did my boxing. I'm willing to sign this deal with these provisions now because I plan to only do 2 more fights, let's say. I think that's plausible. That's very plausible that could happen.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think that about covers our topic for today. Do you have any ending comments, or should I wrap it up?
I guess we can wrap it up. I guess the only note is if people are interested, I post this on my own website, YouTube later with visual graphics. So it's out the audio for a while. And then at some point, whenever I get a chance, I post a video that puts up, in case you get lost in the contracts and stuff and whatever clause I'm commenting. Sometimes I try to put some of the text up and stuff to help people follow along.
Awesome. See, you're getting double dip time here with Jon Nash. I love that. Extra
double dip time. That was an adult movie I watched once.
And for those of you that don't know, Jon actually worked in the porn industry for a little bit.
I did not. I worked in soft porn. That's I never worked out of the minors into the majors. That's
okay. Still, porn is.
It was Skinamax, TNA, a little different. I'm not Eugene here, but I did have a lot because of the people you work with in that. I had a lot of run-ins with the porn industry back in the day.
Oh, we're gonna have a Q&A just about that one of these days. But until then, we got to wrap this one up. So do me a favor, follow this guy on social media. He only has one social media that you can access. That is Twitter. So he is Hey Not The Face on Twitter. But he does have a YouTube. I don't really consider YouTube social media, though. I consider that like streaming media. I don't know. It just seems different. I'm sure it is social media. But I just categorize it myself in a different little subset. So anyways, he is Hey Not The Face on YouTube as well. Am I correct?
I know on YouTube, I'm Jon S. Nash on YouTube.
See, look at me.
Wait, am I? You know, God, I don't even know what I am on YouTube.
Are you?
No, I'm pretty sure. I might. Hold on a second. Let's go to my YouTube channel.
Now we have to go and fix this.
Well, you threw me for a curve. I wasn't ready for that. I was not ready for my YouTube
leave
channel.
This part in so that they can hear our two old asses.
No, you know what? Just cut out the part where I got it wrong because I'm John S. Nash on YouTube.
No, I'm not going to cut that out. Absolutely not. You didn't know what your own YouTube was, and I think
this is not called for. You're a producer. You're supposed to make me look good.
I do all the time, but every once in a while, I'm going to sneak something in.
Okay, fair enough.
This one's not so sneaky though. Anywho, He is Jon S. Nash on YouTube and Hey Not the Face on Twitter. So check him out there, and until next time, please stay safe.
It's not in the face! Thank you.